Anyway, we've been mentioning it a couple of times throughout the show, which I believe I forgot to mention it at the top of the show. Forgot to mention the main feature. That's like forgetting to mention the Stones were headlining Glastonbury. You know, I wouldn't mind if they forgot to mention Mumford & Sons were headlining Glastonbury, because the only contribution they will ever make to music is when they get crushed by a grand piano. But the main feature, comic book movies. Now, these days, pretty much nearly every other big summer blockbuster is a comic book adaptation. You know, we've had plenty this year, haven't we, really, already? You know, Man of Steel was massive, Iron Man 3 as well, and they almost never fail to turn a massive profit, because they've got millions of fans around the world, and as such, they have big budgets, and the more fans they get, the more budgets they get, and so on, until it's a massive spiral of just splurging money everywhere.
Yeah.
And with such big names attached, that even at the worst, these films are usually just alright, you know? Even in the worst comic book movies that we've seen recently, like the third X-Men film, you had like Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen. You know, at the worst, those sort of films are alright. And in short, they're basically a studio's dream, because they cannot fail. They've got a ready-made fan base. They don't have to put a lot of real thought into it in terms of advertising. They can just cast whoever they want, and it'll turn a massive profit. However, there was a time when that wasn't really the case. That time was the 90s. Do you remember them?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. It was all a haze.
It was all a haze, yeah. Well, for half of it, we were effectively comatose, because
yeah, exactly. We were babies.
born in the 90s. Baby.
Yeah. But yeah, so it was a haze. I'm not lying. But back then, comics, just like video games, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking about the Super Mario Brothers movie, of course, was seen as little more than things to keep kids amused. And any adult who read comics was viewed as some sort of basement-dwelling nerd, neckbeard, glasses the size of jam jars. And that was way before Geek Chic was cool too, as a result of Big Bang Theory, my arch nemesis of a show. Oh, God. Anyway, moving quickly on before I have to shove blunt sticks into my eyes to make the pain go away. Because as a result of that kind of stigma, Hollywood didn't really have any reason to care about the movie adaptations at all. The results were famously bad, and the relics of kind of an alien time when comic book movies were mocked, and they were really quite severely laughed at as well, rather than being the eagerly anticipated and enjoyed blockbusters that they are today. And that's usually because they cast people like Shaquille O'Neal in the lead role during his inexplicable foray into acting in the mid-90s. Now, quite why anyone wanted to see an NBA star in a movie is just an absolute mystery to me.
Apart from something like Space Jam.
Are you holding up Space Jam as like the pinnacle of cinematic achievement in the 90s?
Actually, technically wasn't Michael Jordan playing baseball at the time anyway.
Yeah.
So,
but like, sports stars in films, like, why? Like, would you pay to see Wayne Rooney in a film today, for example? Would you pay to see, like, I mean, I'd pay to see Rob Jones in a film, maybe. But apart from that, very limited sports to film crossover appeal.
Some do make sense, though, like Vinnie Jones, he's done it.
But Vinnie Jones is an actor. Like, maybe not necessarily a very good one.
Yeah.
But he is still an actor as opposed to being just a sports star. You know what I mean? Yeah. And Vinnie Jones was never that famous for football anyway, was he?
He grabbed Paul Gascoigne's... I think that's the height of his career, was grabbing Paul Gascoigne's testicles.
To be honest, it would be the height of anyone's career. But anyway, as I said, the 90s was a very, very, very different time. A time that produced Steel, which is the adaptation of a little-known DC comic strip about a heavily armoured superhero. So why Steel was chosen is anyone's guess, because it's hardly the most interesting superpower ever, is it? Just being in a metal suit. No. It's not superhero material. But the casting of Shaquille O'Neal ultimately proved to be sort of the congealed vomit icing on top of the large poo cake, really. Without him, the film is just bland, and it's nothing, barely noticeable, with this wafer-thin plot about illegal weapons trade and shady government officials, like Short Circuit, but minus the charm and really offensive Indian... It actually had a real ethnic minority in it, instead of just a white guy doing an Indian accent, which was really bad. Short Circuit. Oh, I like Short Circuit, but man, those films did not hold up. But with Shaq, it dropped in this 7-foot-tall cardboard cutout for 90% of the action as steel. It was just a guy in a cheap, I can't believe it's not metal armor, who just sucks all love and joy and interesting content out of the film, like a dementor, only with slightly less charisma. He's a spectacularly awful actor. Really bad. Can you imagine someone like him being cast in even a B-grade comic book movie these days? In the lead role, no less. Can you imagine that? No chance at all. No way. And the trend of casting low-grade actors in adaptations of comics no one really cared about was a recurring theme through the 90s, with Billy Zane's The Phantom being just another example. However, even decent comics were being given the star treatment in the 90s, but sadly, with the star being an anus. Like Tank Girl, which is based on Jamie Hewlett's comic of the same name. You might know Jamie Hewlett better for his work as one half of Gorillaz, and after this maybe it's best if he actually sticks to music instead of doing films, because it's just a weird film that's based on a weird comic, but unfortunately the film loses a lot of the charm of the original work, and Hewlett later admitted that he struggled to adapt it properly. It's too manic, and it's just like a sugar-addled kid, and it's impossible to understand, impossible to follow. However, we saved the very worst till last, because unquestionably the worst comic book movie of the 90s is, surprisingly, it's not some obscure superhero who's been rushed onto the silver screen. In fact, the biggest turkey is from the biggest duo of them all. It's Batman and Robin. Yay! This is a film that's so bad, the entire cast and crew has, no joke, spent the last 15 years apologising for it whenever it's been mentioned. And Batman and Robin is just an example of what happens when a studio gets involved too much and starts to have their eye on toy lines rather than wanting to make a decent film. The studio effectively decided the entire direction of the film based on what toys they could make. And to this day, even more so in the height of the Dark Knight trilogy, it just stands as one of the worst examples of spoon-fed corporate bullshit that you will ever see in the history of cinema. Everything is awful. When I was 8, I thought it was awful.
This is the one that's... is this the one famous for the nipples as well?
Yes, it's famous for the Bat-nipples.
Yeah.
And the Bat-asses as well. Yeah. But the female suit doesn't have Bat-nipples on it. Sexism. But it's also famous for just being abysmal. It's famous for being the cinematic equivalent of just someone ripping their own face off and then screaming at you. And screaming and screaming and not ever letting you blink because they're screaming and shoving their own ripped off face into your face. But the face is also neon and coloured with comic sound effects. So that is this film. It's horrible. It's just awful. It's a bad acid trip. It's like a hallucination that never really happened when you view it through the 2013 eyes. Like, how did this film get made? It's just awful in every single area ever. And we all thought it was so bad, we all thought comic movies were dead after it. Thankfully, it wasn't the end. But oh my god, just compare Bane. Like, how wrong did they get him? But the whole point of Bane was that he's a big strong guy who's you know, clever. In this, he goes around, bomb! And he's planting bombs everywhere. Yeah. And he just goes, bomb!
The only thing about Bane in that movie, which was actually, I suppose, correct, was he looked more like Bane was meant to look, though, as opposed to with the...
Don't defend this movie. Don't you defend this film. I think we're going to leave it there because I'm just genuinely offended that you've got a positive thing to say out of this awful, awful travesty of an awful abortion of a film. God, I'm leaving.